Welcome to episode 6 of the Monday Night Review. Today I'm joined by one of my oldest friends and favourite people to share stories with, Frank Turner. We recorded this back in January. It's taken me this long to get around to editing it, and I hope you really enjoy it. It reminded me of hanging out on the beach in Cornwall when we were little, and he would always have weird historical stories that really fascinated me. So here we are. I hope you enjoy it. Today's guest is most famously known as a singer-songwriter, but is someone who's been annoying me for about 30 years with weird and often interesting stories, and was the first person I thought of when I thought of doing this podcast because he knows a lot about stuff. It's Frank Turner. I very nearly called you Francis.
Well, you can call me. You're one of the few people who's allowed to call me Francis, given that it has been just shy of 30 years. I'm not quite that old yet. Thank you very much.
I know, neither am I. I'm a child.
But we've known each other a while. It is true. And what a joy that's been.
It's been a pleasure for both of us.
Exactly.
So you were originally the first person that sprung to mind because I thought I just want people I know or people I don't know to tell me the weird stuff that they think I'll be interested in. And basically, since we met, you've been telling me weird stuff that you think I'll be interested in.
And so, have you been interested in any of it?
I have been interested in a lot of it, which I think is possibly why our relationship has lasted so long.
Well, that's a relief. But yes, I mean, I do. I'm a history nerd and a fact fan. And when you asked me to do this, I went through lots of different options of things I could talk about. I seem to think that your brief says that you included the word spooky.
I like spooky because I like spooky. I kind of imagined, and you very sensibly, before we press record, got your lighting just spooky enough.
I have got spooky lighting in here. This thing, I went through a number of things that we could talk about, and some of them weren't really spooky. I was going to talk about the Katyn massacre in Poland in 1939, 1940.
Which I don't know anything about.
Yeah, it's not really spooky. It's just grindingly awful. And it's a really
We'll
horrific...
save that for a later episode.
Yes, for a later episode. I was going to talk about the black metal scene in Norway, which is quite spooky, and I have a book about it, literally.
It's also quite grindingly awful, isn't it?
It was quite grinding. Well, this is the thing. The problem with that is that they were just awful. Am I allowed to swear on this podcast?
Yes, God, yeah.
Awful twats.
Yeah.
I mean, they made some very interesting music, and the one thing that I suppose one could say for them is that they walked the walk. They didn't just sing songs about Satan; they were actual Satanists. It was very unpleasant. So I tried to find something that was a bit more kind of traditionally spooky, and then reminded myself of the fact that I'm going to be a salesman for 10 seconds.
Do it, go.
Year before last, I put out an album called No Man's Land, which is a history record, each song was about a different historical figure who'd been largely overlooked by popular culture. That was the brief I started writing. Over time, it transpired that all of the stories I was interested in were about female historical figures, so it's a record about overlooked historical female figures. But they're all people, and I wrote songs about each of them, and I made a podcast to go with it. But I wanted to tell you about one of those characters. If that's okay.
There was a woman
well, there we go. It's a woman by the name of Jinny Bingham, who is a real historical figure, and her life is linked to a place where you and I have got drunk together.
More than once,
yes.
I have to say that when you sent me a message saying who you're going to do today, and I was resisting Googling it, I had spent the entire day thinking, I'd do quite a lot of awful things if I could just have one night off in Camden in the late 90s. If we could just go and do that again. I'd feel a lot better about the whole current situation.
Yeah, I sort of feel a bit like if this goes on much longer, what's that? There's that movie series where you're allowed to break all the laws for one day. or something.
What's that? No, don't know.
Oh, I can't remember what it's called. I haven't actually seen him, but the principle is there's one day of the year when all laws are off, basically.
Oh, okay, that sounds
and I
great.
feel like they could do that with coronavirus restrictions. They sort of did it with Christmas. They have one day where we're allowed to go and get shit-faced in Camden, and then we'll all get sick. And
then we'll all get sick, and it'll be bad. We could go back.
This is a rubbish idea, as I talk this through. Anyway, so yes, a woman by the name of Jinny Bingham. Would you like me to tell you about Jinny Bingham?
I would like you to tell me about Jinny Bingham. Also
known as many things. Old Mother Redcap, she was known as. She was known as the Shrew of Kentish Town, was one of her monikers.
I mean, on her behalf, I take offence at that.
Well, this is the thing. There's actually a lot of interesting history in there. I'm going to make it interesting, I promise. Because a lot of it has to do with assigned gender roles in that period of history, and in particular to do with the regard for elder women in that period of history. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Judy Bingham was born in the roughly sort of 1620s or so in Kentish Town in North London, an area that you and I know well. And she was married young. I'll talk about how we know all of this in a little bit. She was married young. Her first husband was called Gypsy George, and he was from Holloway, so a mile away or so, and he was a sheep thief. This is a period of time when Holloway was kind of rural land, and he was arrested for being a sheep thief, and he was hung at Tyburn, and therefore she was quite early on, she was a young widow. And she moved to Camden Town and started a coaching house. That was at the time, again, Camden wasn't really that much of a place. It was a crossroads that lay on the route, the cattle droving route that came from the Midlands to Smithfield Market via such places as the Highgate, for example, where they went over the hill, and down the Holloway Road, and then into Camden, where, you know, the bit where Camden Tube Station is. Yeah, it's a pathway. A meeting of pathways, so it's a pretty smart place to have a coaching house. So,
and she just said isn't that quite a big thing for a woman to do at that time?
It is. I mean, I'm not sure whether she set it up from scratch or whether she took ownership of the place that was already there. But she became the landlady there, and she remarried, and she married a man whose name was Pitcher, Pitcher, who. Well, this is the thing. This story kind of there's the myth and there's the fact part of it, because it has been sort of ghost storified over the years, as it were. But she married Pitcher, and then Pitcher died not long afterwards. And the sort of the myth is that she poisoned him because he beat her. Now, the things to bear in mind is that as well as being a landlady, she was also an apothecary, as in essentially a doctor, or the closest thing to a doctor that people from the lower classes would have had at that period of time. And of course, in a pre-scientific age, somebody who's involved in kind of cooking up chemicals, ingredients, whatever, herbs, and giving them to people that affect them, that's viewed with some suspicion by some people. Yeah. Do you know what I mean? It's witchery. Whether or not Jinny Bingham actually killed Pitcher is unclear.
But they were all viewed with suspicion.
Yes, they were all viewed with suspicion. So she had that one. The important part of the story now is that she's getting older, and that sort of early modern society was quite unclear as to what social role elder women were supposed to play.
When you say older,
difficult to say because we don't know when she was born, but old by the standards of the time.
Yeah, exactly. So are we thinking 40s?
Probably 40s, okay. Yes, at a guess. She had another husband who then was found dead in the coaching house in the oven where he burned to death. Now, this part, I'm not sure that you should, but I find it quite funny because she got arrested for murder. Yeah. Now, there is a sort of general understanding that part of the reason that she got arrested was because quite a lot of the more respectable locals, because Camden at this point is sort of, it's becoming part of the city slowly. Mm-hmm. And the kind of people who run coaching houses, you've got to bear in mind the kind of people who would stop at this coaching house would generally speaking be itinerants, travellers, probably outlaws, you know, socially outsiders, let's say. Okay. So she's not hugely popular with the local great and the good. So she gets arrested, and there's a real sense that there was a kind of like, finally, we've got a kind of vibe. She got acquitted of the murder charge because in the most hilarious way, she said or somebody said in her defense, it's not entirely clear, that what had happened was she had a famous temper, and her husband was scared of her rages and went and hid in the oven from one of her towering rages without somehow realizing that this was an oven. And then when the oven got well, I think it then got turned on or, fired up for the morning bread or whatever it might be. And that's how he died. And the thing was, it sounds terribly unlikely, but this was testified by a number of local witnesses. So she clearly had some sort of allies in the area.
Also, and, I have a fearsome rage. So, if Joe could,
you do, and I could imagine hiding from you in an oven. Well, maybe not an oven, but in a small, dark, secure place.
Yeah, fair enough.
Anywhere will do.
I'm wondering if Joe will end up hiding in an oven.
I would just run him through the yeses and the nos. Covered under the stairs, yes.
Yeah, it seems
oven
choice.
No.
Yeah.
Anyway, she was acquitted for this, and the time passes. Her coaching house. It became known as the Old Mother. Well, possibly not in her lifetime. It was known as the Old Mother Redcap, but that was the place she was running. It became a very well-known place. It didn't have a particularly good reputation. As I say, it was a place where because you're talking about an area of the world that would have been full of kind of highwaymen and that sort of thing as well.
Yeah,
so
people up to no good.
Exactly. So, and she, the last of her, I think there were 4 husbands in total, including Gypsy George, who all met various sticky ends. One's poisoned. I think one disappeared. One burned in the oven, and then one was hanged at Tyburn. And time passes, and she gets older and older and older, and there are stories of her essentially being a kind of insular figure, kind of a figure of fun for the local kids. This is where we get into the whole thing about witchcraft, because obviously we're talking about a century where a lot of people believed in witchcraft, and that goes into the whole thing about people not really understanding what a social role for a spinster essentially would be, or a widow, whatever it might be. She ran her own business. It was very unusual at the time. It was a business that wasn't considered reputable. She wasn't under the aegis of a male figure, and she was old and cantankerous and used to kind of shake her fist at people.
And had a habit of losing husbands.
Yeah, and had a habit of losing husbands. So over time, the word witch gets attached to her. So she gets called a witch. And there were stories about the local kids used to follow around throwing stones at her. And she had a black cat that everybody said was her familiar, and this kind of thing. So the last part of the actual story is that she was on the day that she died, and several local people attested that the morning of the day that she died, they saw the devil go into her house. It's not explained how they identified the devil as being the devil, whether he was a big red dude with a pitchfork, or whether it was a suave man in a coat with a pointy beard, or what. But essentially, after the fact, obviously, people said they'd seen the devil go in there, and the mythology would be that he'd gone to reclaim her soul, her having made a deal, and written in his book would have been the way it would have been. Anyway, she died. They ended up having to break down the door to her house because they didn't know she died. She just disappeared, and there was presumably a smell of some kind of whatever. And they went in, and there was a cauldron boiling on an open fire when they got in there. Still, she lay dead next to it, dead for several days. And the next part is, apparently they had to break the chair that her body was in to get her body out, to take it out of the house, burial. But also, they were suspicious of what might be boiling in the cauldron of a suspected witch. And the legend has it that the cat came in, and they fed the cat a bowl of whatever was in the cauldron, and all the cat's hair fell out immediately, and then it died. And this was considered further proof that she had been a witch.
I mean, that seems a bit harsh on the cat.
It does. But I mean, who else are you going to try it on? If you believe the cat to be a familiar, you're not going to give it to a local kid.
But it's not the cat's fault.
If the cat is a familiar, you could make an argument that it was the cat's fault.
I hope Booty Cat's not listening to this.
My cat, I'm not a witch and neither is my wife. Thank you very much. Also, my cat is the most suspicious eater. It's just not a chance. But anyway, so Judy Bingham dies. Now, the next part, there are a couple more bits of the story.
She dies of old age? Of rotting flesh?
I think so. I think she dies of old age. I think she was quite old by the sense of time. By the time she died, so but everyone decided she was a witch. The next about 50 years later or so, the coaching house is in the hands of new owners. Obviously, it's still a going concern, and they're the ones who start really pushing the legend of Old Mother Redcap because it's kind of a business thing. Do you know what I mean? It's like right. It's the house of the witch, the coaching house of the witch. You can come, and I'd imagine you could go and see the oven where
see the
someone got
chair.
Exactly. It's either a hellish cat corpse or something. Yeah. So it becomes part of the local law of Camden. And the coaching house, because it is to this day quite a good place to run a pub or an establishment, should we say. Yeah. It's these days opposite. It's not the same building, but on the exact same spot now is the pub, the World's End. The World's End is the Old Mother Redcap. And in fact, the World's End was still called the Old Mother Redcap until the mid-1980s. So whilst the building has been rebuilt here and there.
That rang a bell.
Yeah, and there was the Old Mother Blackcap as well. So there were two in Camden quite near each other, which was, Camden had a rival witch story at the Old Mother Blackcap, about which less is known. That was just on the top of the high street going down towards Mornington Crescent. Yeah. But the Old Mother Redcap was a bigger deal. It only changed its name in the 1980s. Obviously, the building's been rebuilt. There's a debate about whether or not any of the building that is currently there is part of what was there. It is a good spot. You know, when you go into the World's End, there's a little kind of drinking den down at the back where you go down a few stairs. Yeah. If any of the building is still related to what was there in her time, it would be that bit. But we don't know. Okay. But and then of course underneath the World's End is the Underworld, which is a classic punk rock venue that you and I both know well. And that also is part of the same building complex. So whether or not any of that is linked is unknown. There are a series of ghost stories over the years that none of them are particularly consistent or well established. But the one thing that is interesting about that is the reason that we know almost everything we know about Jinny Bingham is because of Bram Stoker, the man who wrote Dracula, who was from Camden and was himself an amateur antiquarian.
Was he from Camden?
So he was from Camden, and he wrote Dracula later in his career, and it was obviously a rip-roaring success. But before then, he was a struggling journalist, and one of the things he did whilst being a struggling journalist was collect local antiquarian knowledge and local history and that kind of thing. So his writings about Jinny Bingham are the main source. He was reading other sources that, as far as anybody knows, have since been lost. But pretty much everything we know about Jinny Bingham's life now comes from the writings of Bram Stoker.
That's amazing.
It's a good fact, right?
It's a really good
there you
fact. Go. Also, for someone who considers themselves quite well read, I can't believe I didn't know he came from Camden.
Indeed. Abraham Stoker, as his real name was. Bram is a diminutive.
I didn't know that. I just assumed he was exotic.
Before anybody tweets at me about this, I'm not 100% sure if he was from Camden, but he certainly lived there for most of his working life.
Well, that's good enough for me.
Yes, and then my final little fact tidbit that I'm going to try and throw into this, other than the fact that I then went on to write a song about it, hooray, is that next door to the Old Mother Blackcap, which was the other witch-based pub in Camden, in a building that is now, I think I'm right in saying, a Costa Coffee, used to be... Well, quite. Used to be one of the great music halls of the music hall era in the 19th century, and I'm obsessed with the history of music hall. And there is a series of very famous paintings of a music hall that was done by Walter Sickert. You've probably seen them. They're all done from the gods. They were painted they were based on sketches made. They were supposed to be of the interior of the theatre that was next to the Old Mother Blackcap. And Walter Sickert is suspected by some people to be Jack the Ripper.
Yep. I'm not sure where I stand on that one. Boom. Also,
so, as I mentioned at the beginning, you and I have got drunk in that building many times.
I had no idea
Well, part of the way that I found out about it was that actually in recent years the World's End have put up a plaque telling some of this story in the entranceway, kind of behind a grill, but it's pretty not well lit or advertised.
No.
But I think in truth, I think I was being stood up for a date one time, and I was stood there and looking for something to do at my time. And I ended up reading this, having a good old breeze, and there it was.
I was going to say, have you read John Major's book on music halls?
I have. What a weird surprise that the best book on the history of music hall was written by former Tory Prime Minister John Major. But it's because his father was a music hall performer.
Yeah, and I worked at the publishers when they did that book, and the meeting was very weird when they said his next book is going to be on the history of the music hall.
I have a Chas and Dave tattoo, which is related to this, because one of the many reasons I love Chas and Dave is that they are the last surviving remnant of music hall in British culture.
Will this be the next move for Frank Turner, some form of music?
I have considered the merits of making a musical album, because music hall predates the recording era, but it doesn't predate the era of sheet music, obviously. So all of the songs still exist, but not in recorded form. So it would be interesting to be. I'd have to get better at reading music.
Can you not?
Not really.
Can you not?
I play by ear.
More and more high pitched. But I always think
I'm a folk musician, darling.
I know, but I seem to remember you tinkling the ivories when we were young, and I assumed it was from music.
But I have Matt, who plays in my band, can read music, so I'll get him to just do it all, and then I'll take the credit.
That seems like a really good plan. He's a bloody genius music reader, by my assumption.
Well, going back to the subject of witchcraft, Matt is somebody who can sort of think of musical ideas and then write them down in his notebook in the back of a van while we're touring the USA without an instrument anywhere near him, and can write out arrangements that way, which I regard as being a form of witchcraft.
Yeah, that's not normal, is it?
Indeed, so did everybody else in my band, and we seriously considered dunking him.
Yeah, I would. I'm all for dunking. Matt, if you're listening, that's going to be the next Sound Clue Part 2. Thank you. That was enlightening and spooky and wonderful.
Excellent. I'm glad. Oh, and I hope that once all of this pandemic nonsense is over, you and I can go and have another drink at the well.
Take selfies in front of the weird plaque?
I'd imagine we will.
I think we probably will.
It seems likely.
It seems likely, and then 3 weeks later I'll look at my phone and have no idea what's going on, because I'll have taken the photo really badly, and that will be it.
What, when you finally sobered up?
When I finally sobered up, I will be no good for historical sources, because who knows what will be happening. Thank you very much for coming on and telling us. It
is an absolute pleasure, and it's lovely to see you, even if remotely.
I know, it's very nice to see you. You look the same, never age. Really insulting.
I have grey hair in my beard now, thank you.
I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. Thank you so much for listening. For any links to Frank's music, there's a link in the show notes. There's also a link for my Patreon, which you can go and check out for extra content. And until next time, be kind, stay safe, and always check the back seat before you drive.